Hey guys, what's going on? It's the middle of the day on a Saturday, so I figured what better time to film a YouTube video talking about why software developers hate taking coding interviews. So, yeah, maybe if I just. So, the first thing that comes up for why software developers hate taking coding interviews is, and this definitely, like, I've experienced this myself, I've talked to lots of other developers who have experienced this, and this is just that coding interviews tend not to match what you expect to see in real life when you're actually on the job. So, the content of the interview doesn't seem to really have anything to do in a lot of cases with what actual software engineering is like. The reality of modern software engineering for a lot of engineers and a lot of companies out there is that you're going to be using frameworks and algorithms and data structures that have already been implemented in basically every language rather than sort of reinventing the wheel and building that again yourself. So having an interview that's structured around writing those things seems to be a little weird. Like it doesn't really make sense that's what you're being tested on if you don't even have to do that when you're on the job. And I think from a data structures and algorithm standpoint, like a hash map is going to solve 90 to 95% of your problems. And if it's not, you're probably doing something wrong. So another thing that's come up for me, and I haven't seen this mentioned too much, but it's definitely been my experience that, in interviewing for various tech companies, larger ones, smaller ones, that's just that, there's a lot of times when you get into an interview, your interviewer is just bad at giving an interview. Like they just, for one reason or another, they're bad at it. Either they just, they are new to it. They haven't, I've seen that at least a couple of times. They're a brand new interviewer, so they don't have a lot of experience with it, or they just haven't invested the time to really develop that skill of giving and administering an interview. Yeah, there's definitely a high skill level in terms of being able to administer interviews well. I've had bad interviewers and I've had good interviewers, and the good ones really shine because you can tell they put some effort into it and they know what they're doing. In a lot of cases, when your interviewer is bad, it can just leave you feeling overwhelmed in the interview or like you don't know what to do and you're just sitting there frustrated. And sometimes you don't realize that in the interview, but you kind of realize after the fact, like, wow, my interview wasn't really helpful, or they kept talking over me the whole time and I couldn't really, get a thought out or think through problems without them. Yeah, so that's a big one that comes up is just if your interviewer is bad at giving interviews, that is a big reason to hate taking them. Yeah, so another big one that comes up, and I think this one is talked about less just because it is kind of hard to talk about and hard to admit in some cases, is that you're just more unprepared for the interview than you realize. I know in my experience, going through a lot of these interviews at larger tech companies, when I first kind of did my first loop or my first loop of those interviews, I kind of thought to myself, I've been a software engineer at other companies for enough years now that I should have a fair shot at this. Like how hard can it be, right? type of thinking. And I definitely got taste of some pretty difficult medicine to swallow on those first couple interviews where, at the time I thought in the interview, maybe I had a good chance, but looking back, I just, looking back on those now, and it's easy to see how unprepared I actually was and how in over my head I was. And I can only imagine, I guess I can understand now why a lot of my interviewers were looking at me with a funny face as I tried to stumble through a question that I had no clue how to solve for 45 minutes. So a big issue that's come up for me for taking coding interviews, and I've definitely had friends that have experienced this as well, is that once you do a couple of these, you start to realize that interviewing itself is a skill. That it's a skill in itself that you have to develop. There's a whole lot more that goes into it than just knowing data structures and algorithms. And it takes a lot of practice to get good at. And that's something that in my first interviews that I went out for, I just hadn't. You just don't know what to expect if you've only gone out for a couple of them, and that can leave you feeling like the interview itself was a sham. Yeah, if you want to start to enjoy these interviews and feel like you actually have a shot at passing them, it is totally worthwhile to just develop that skill of interviewing. And I think that involves, doing lots of mock interviews, which I neglected for a long time. I think those are, I kind of just thought, oh, I'll just solve a bunch of leak code or algorithms problems and that'll get me far enough. But actually practicing the skill of interviews is super important. And I think not practicing them and not realizing that interviewing is a skill can kind of leave a bad taste in your mouth for doing coding interviews. And sort of as a final reason for why coding interviews can suck for a lot of software developers, and I think this applies more to, engineers who have a couple years of experience in the industry. They got a couple years under their belt. Maybe they've worked a job or two and they've sort of gotten a hang of things and, they know the ropes now. Is that a lot of really, really important topics for modern software engineering tend to be neglected in these interviews. Don't get me wrong, understanding your data structures and algorithms can be really important in a lot of cases. And, understanding them well will definitely make you a better, more competent software engineer. But that doesn't mean that an interview should be solely comprised of that. And that's the only thing you should focus on, because there are tons of other topics that are just as important as those two. Things like soft skills and communication are, a lot of people kind of discount those, but they're hugely important. Another huge area that's neglected in a lot of these interviews is just being able to design systems, or to be a systems thinker is kind of how I like to think about it. In a lot of modern software engineering environments, you're not just coding one single application that lives on one machine, but you're probably coding 3 or 4 different applications at the same time, and they all need to send data to each other and talk to each other, and you have to think at sort of a higher level to be able to think about, like, okay, how am I going to make this work together, and how am I going to make this scalable? So yeah, I know there are a lot of system design interviews out there, and I've done a fair amount of system design interviews themselves. But I think, a lot of the most effective interviews that I've seen for coding tend to combine elements of designing a system with actually writing code. So the interviews touch on a lot of, important topics that might be neglected in an interview that's just purely solving an algorithms problem. Anyway, guys, that's about all the thoughts I had on why developers have a tough time with coding interviews and hate them. I think there are a lot of negative aspects about coding interviews, a lot of things that could be improved, but there are also a lot of positive aspects. And yeah, I do plan on doing a video on some of the more positive aspects about coding interviews and why they're actually not that bad. So let me know if you guys are interested in that in the comments, and also please hit subscribe if you like this content.